So Damien though was busy this weekend. I heard he was all over Clubhouse, just dropping fire bombs all over the place.
That's right. I know. I actually dropping f bombs. Um, that too, actually. But yeah, it was a lot of fun. I've been guerrilla style attacking marketing rooms and talking about brand and identity. And anybody who dares talk about brand, I just am like, oh, how much do you know about the science of identity and how does that like play a role? And they're like, well,
Curveball.
yeah.
Any heated debates?
Um, I
And
wouldn't
passionate.
say heated.
Well,
I would say there are some people who are like kind of tap dance around what I'm saying because they don't want to be shut down and they just don't know. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
I'm not like trying to be an
Yeah,
asshole about
trying to
it, but
get people.
the truth is, and I mean, maybe I like getting people a little bit, but I know that's my ego. The truth is, people just don't know, right? And it's when you think about it, it's weird.
It is
It's
super
weird
weird.
that this entire industry talks about brand identity all day, and then you ask them, like, how much do you know about identity? And they're like, uh, and they say the most trite BS stuff, right? Oh, it's like, it's your essence of the company. Like, cool. Like, how does that work? Like,
Mhm.
how do you apply an essence? You know, how does that make it into your branding? Well, you see, you got to make sure that it's really aligned to what's authentically true. It's like, cool. What does that mean? And how do you do that? And I'm not saying it because I don't know. I'm saying it because I do, and I don't think anyone else does. But I put the time in to know, right? So,
Yeah.
but so it's been really cool. It's been really interesting, and I mean, I'm making it sound like I'm just this like crusading victor, which I am. But I'm learning a lot in it too, and a lot of what I'm learning is just like how deep I go down that end, and so people have no idea what I'm talking about, right? So
Mhm.
I was thinking of what you were saying, Duran, about how do marketers think about brand.
Yeah.
I've been getting that in these conversations, right?
Mm.
And I can see a big weakness in mine in that I'm obviously can be very tactical because I've done lots of tactical projects for companies. But I'm very bad at communicating
Mm.
tactically,
Mhm.
about tactics and about the like on the ground. That I usually like to like, there's a lot of jazz happening tactically.
Mhm.
And so and yeah, I mean, even then, I have a hard time talking about it until someone brings up something specific or they say something
Yeah.
like, "Oh yeah, no, I do that," and but I don't think about it that way. And so I'm usually like so far. Somebody was saying today in a room that I was just listening in, they were saying, um, and she couched it right. She was like, I don't want to get all like philosophical or
Mm.
anything. But we really like the stories that we tell ourselves end up being who we are. And there was kind of like a distancing that happened even as she said that.
Mm.
And I was like, oh man, that's too philosophical for people. Like,
Yeah.
whoa, you're not ready for my podcast. I'll tell you.
Uh-huh.
We're gonna go on a journey. So I don't know how to bridge that gap, and I still believe in exactly what we talked about 3 years ago now. In that the way design is popular now,
Mhm.
where it never there was nothing cool about talking about design or design thinking unless you were a designer,
Mhm.
20 years ago. Similarly, I think the next move is going to be integrating philosophy into business. And I really believe that. And people are already doing it. And it's not even new. It's been a slow burn kind of coming in for a long time. And so it's
Mhm.
really about that idea is like an idea whose time is maybe not come, but is about to.
Mhm.
Um, but I think that it's still really tough for people to see how it's applicable. So it gives us a really good challenge, right? It tells us that like one of our main foci should be plotting exactly the path. How do you take something super abstract and philosophical and then make it progressively more practical until it's like boom, useful? And of course we do that in our work.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I know how we do that.
Yeah. No, I think we're brilliant at it, but how do we explain it to people?
Yeah, exactly.
In a way that they're going to understand it. That's part of it too, right? Is like, you know, I don't mean to make it sound like I think we're geniuses, but we are. But you know, I mean, a doctor or a physicist. Can you imagine being like a physicist and trying to explain what you do to people?
Yeah.
You know, and then like you say one thing and then they're like, oh yeah, like we're all quantumly entangled. And it's like, that's not what I meant. And so like, it must be really frustrating, right? And so we just have a similar problem, which makes sense because we took something very soft and abstract, or seemingly so, and we put a bunch of deep, hard science behind it that the average person isn't exposed to. And so, yeah, you know, our main job then is about that education piece. And I think we're best served in that education piece in like, how do we explain that to people with very little? I mean, there's a ton of people out there. Brand is way more in the zeitgeist and in the common lexicon now than it was even 10 years ago.
I think it's like overly used, like
Definitely.
Unfortunately.
And you know, and wrongly used.
Yeah, that's what I was pointing to.
So, but I think, you know, while more people are talking about it now, there's a lot of people who still don't know anything about brand, right? It reminds me of, we talked about it before. I don't know if Maldonado has heard this story, but when I was at LinkedIn and I was like really excited and I wanted to like give them the talk about how you know, the next version of design thinking, right? So like, okay, like design thinking is kind of passe, but we're going to do like our own version of design thinking. And so I was like, started talking about it. And like one of the guys broke in and was like, Damien, do you want to like explain to everybody what design thinking is? And I was like, oh, yeah, well, you all have heard of IDEO. And it was like crickets.
Did you take a survey of the room?
Yeah, and I was like, okay, raise your hand if you've heard of IDEO. And there was like 2-3 people. And I was like,
and this is in what department at LinkedIn?
This was, who all was there? This was real estate, facilities. But I mean, you know, this like
it's in design and build though, right?
No, exactly. So this is like the people designing, yeah. And I mean, a lot of the like straight, you know, designers knew, but
yeah,
there was, you know, there's a lot of people in there. There's like almost 150 people in the room.
Wow.
And so like I'm telling you, there's like next to nobody knew what design thinking was. I said something about Tim Brown.
Man, here in the Valley too. Like it's not like you were in Massachusetts.
Yeah, this is the tip of the spear, you know? Like I might as well have been, you know, talking to a church group in the middle of Oklahoma or something. You know?
Yeah.
No idea. And so it helps us understand just how, you know, deep in our own bubble we are. Like we aren't understood by people in our bubble, right? So it's like we're real deep in the bubble. And so, you know, and so it's good just to talk to marketers because get an idea of, you know, of course we can make their jobs much easier and more effective and more importantly more efficient, right? But not if we can't tell them that in a language that they understand, and not if I have to give them a PhD in order to understand it.
I mean, you probably should have what do they call it when someone grants someone a degree from a school they never went to, it was like
Like an honorary degree?
yeah, you should have an honorary PhD in brand from somebody somewhere.
Probably, yeah.
So I'm really curious, what are some of the frames and contexts that you've been hearing from different marketers lately about brand?
Yeah, so I mean, it's not surprising. It falls into three pretty predictable buckets. And there's a lot of talk that's still about your like logo and your name, and
Okay.
like this kind of like recognition identification piece
Mhm.
of, and it's funny to be in these rooms, everybody's saying the word brand and I'm listening to them talk past each other, right? Because they're talking about different things. But if you aren't aware that there's different definitions, then you're not even noticing that they're talking about two different things at the same time. But so, you have a fair portion of people who are talking about a logo, a name, or some other identification of the company, which of course we say is type 1 definition of brand identification. And then you hear a lot of talking about like really your presence, your reputation, or what we would call a type 2 definition of perception. There's a lot of talk about crafting the world's perception of you, right? And that
but authentically, right? It has to be authentic.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. But they don't even say that, because mostly they're talking about like, I heard somebody just today, somebody asked like, how do you craft your brand? And he said, I just pay really close attention to my customers and I'm just constantly shifting to what they want. And I'm like, and so I tried to ease it in as best I could. I was like, so I'm gonna push back real quick. As like, if I'm a person that we're meeting and coming into your group of friends, and I'm just changing whoever I am to be who you guys want me to be, like we would rightly call that person a sociopath. And why do we judge companies any different? And do you end up seeing then sociopathic behaviors from companies and wonder why they behave like like axe murderers or something? It's like, well, this is the way we allow them to first be introduced to us, right? And in fact, the marketing and brand has institutionalized the process of turning good companies into sociopaths. And so it's like, well, yeah, for sure. Like, please don't encourage people to do that anymore. Crafting perception is really, really dangerous, especially when it's not authentic. And that means when it's not coming from a place of deep knowing of who you are to begin with.
Yeah.
Right? If you don't know who you are and what motivates you and drives you, then you don't know how to shift people's perception just so they can see you more clearly from the context that they're coming from, not see something totally new entirely that will make them like you or whatever. So those are probably the two main places. Then I hear this thing where people are wanting to say something around type 3 definition of identity. So there's a little bit of talk about identity, or it's the personality of a company, or it's
the values,
the essence.
Yeah.
There's the spirit of the company. I like that when people say that. I don't disagree with that. I just think most people don't know what that actually means. So it's great to say brand is the spirit of a company. Okay, now imagine yourself as like a brand strategist and you're showing up at Apple tomorrow and it's your job to figure out the spirit of the company. And by the way, don't let it be just something that you're like, I feel like it's this, right?
Which is what people do.
Totally. And so how's that any different than like divination, right? It's like going to a palm reader for your brand, right? I mean, it's ultimately what it is, rather than like taking a deep inventory and finding out who it is that you are. You're like,
man,
oh, like, I think you're this now. Oh, I think that'll play well with the audience. It's like, oh, nope, we're right back to perception again.
I was thinking about this. It's no surprise that companies and brands and brand strategists and marketers struggle with actually like figuring out their authentic self so that they can express that properly and be aligned to it. we are in a place in culture and history where we're struggling with that with ourselves as humans.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're making a lot of progress. I'm really happy. The last decade or so, I've seen a huge spike in being aware of self-awareness and looking for tools to apply that to ourselves. I think there's a big gap between being able to do that for yourself and being able to facilitate that process for an organization of multiple human beings and stakeholders. So
I mean, okay, to make like a really long journey short, right? I spent 10 years like obsessing over what is brand. It was driving me crazy. And, imagine my frustration when I finally realized what it is. And I'm like, it's identity. And it's like, wait, we've been saying that forever. Like,
brand identity.
total epiphany, because I realized, like, no, it's actually identity.
Mm-hmm.
But people have been talking about it so screwed up that I hadn't made that connection, even though we're actually using that word. So the moment I realized it, I was excited because I was like, dope. All we have to do is go into the psychology research and we're going to know exactly everything you need to know about identity. And so I go into the psychology research and I'm like, oh,
where is it?
Yeah, right. So you've got some stuff that's like 30 years old. Everything else other than that is like now almost 100 years old, right? And so it's like Jung and Heidegger and Freud. It's like not a lot, and it's kind of like just touched on. It's not unpacked that deeply. Sociology has done a much better job of going deeper, but they're missing the boat entirely. Sorry, sociologists. But it's true. And every sociologist I talk to, within 10 minutes, they're like, okay, yeah, that's fair. But what sociologists look at as identity is actually social identity.
Mm-hmm.
Like they don't look at personal identity at all. All they see is, who you are as a man or who you are as a woman or as a, ethnic group or within your context, right? For sociologists, identity is shaped by context. And it's like, no, I mean, supremely unhealthy people, yes, right? But like what you really want is you want an authentic, a well-formed, a strong, personal identity that then is expressed into those different contexts, right? And then then I move on, right? And I talked to this anthropologist and they blew my mind. And I was like, oh, anthropology. And I go into there, but there's a lot of brilliant stuff in anthropology.
Yeah.
But it's obviously really closely tied with cultural identity. And cultural identity, I would argue, rather, yeah, right, exactly. Largely social identity. And it blends these areas. It's actually often the expression of collective identity. And so you end up in this whole mixed up thing, and of course so then no wonder the people in marketing rooms who spend most of their days like optimizing Facebook ads, right, like don't know what identity is. If you talk to the scientists, they're all talking past each other, talking about the same thing from totally different perspectives. And then you talk to the pastor of a church, and identity all of a sudden is very different. And that has more of a philosophical or a theological base. But now you're really talking about this composite view of who we are, which I don't know, I could go off the deep end there. But I was just having this conversation, like, is it just the average of the things, how people describe me, right? Or is it that those things describe me in that way because of something else in the middle, right? Does the triangle shape the outer forms, or does the outer forms shape the triangle? It's a really, anyway.
Yeah.
Question, important stuff.
We'll have to insert that diagram here. No, that's awesome. And I think it sheds a lot of light on why we're facing such a large gap in understanding of brand identity, because people aren't dealing with the identity aspect of it, and they're relying on this intuitive, noble attempt to try to figure out their authentic self. And they're subconsciously defaulting to these socially informed contexts to try and figure out who they are and express that. The problem is that's like circular logic. Like
Exactly. So how does Trump become so powerful, right? And not just Trump, right? Like, I mean, it's certainly happening on other sides of the aisle too. And so it's not to be, one side or the other
sure.
politically, but like somebody like Trump rises to power with that type of rhetoric, right? Because people are really shaken about who they are, especially if you're talking about middle America that deeply identified themselves based on a collective identity, which is that of like being an American. And now that national identity is really shifting.
Mm-hmm.
And so now you're really concerned about who is it that I am. And then somebody comes in and says, look, this is who you are. I'm going to tell you. You don't got to think about it. Just look over here.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very enticing, right? And in fact, I could give you the names of lots of other people who did exactly that. Most of them are dead and they're all cult leaders. So, and, I had talked about years ago that I think one of the biggest concerns I have about the future is the type of work that we're doing, deep identity stuff, being weaponized against people. And somebody I was talking to was like, oh, well, that's been happening for a really long time with advertising and propaganda. Like, that's nothing new. And it's like, no, it's something new, right? Like, imagine it on the level of a cult leader, right?
Yeah.
And you think about things like Jonestown or Heaven's Gate, and you had people who killed themselves, took their own lives because they were so identified with the organization and the organization was ending. You have people who have sacrificed their children, both as like sexual slaves and as, and have killed their children for the cult, right? And so it happened at Waco, it happened at Jonestown. You know what it takes to get a human being to sacrifice their child? Like, that is a deep level of psychological programming. And the fact that that's kind of being democratized at scale is definitely concerning. And so what's our best antidote for that, right? Raise people's awareness of it, right? The more people know about this stuff, the more accountability there is for it, right? So if we give everybody keys to the kingdom on brand and identity and make everybody understand it the way that we do, it's not like our work becomes any less powerful, right? Our work actually becomes better because there's accountability on it. And there's all kinds of examples of science plus accountability is great, and science sans accountability is awful. And so, I think that's really what we need to do is just do our part to raise awareness around this science and how it's being used, because a lot of it, like, as much as the research is kind of scant, there's a lot more out there than people realize, right? For us, we wish there was more research out there.
Sure, yeah.
I want to run like 10 research studies right now. I could tell you exactly where to start, where we want to learn more. But for the average person, like, man, there's so much people can know about themselves, about who they are, about how to heal from trauma, about how to, find yourself and develop purpose, how to build great relationships and community. We know a lot about this stuff at this point. But there's just not a widespread understanding of what's out there.
Yeah. So I want to go in a direction here. I want to talk about the sense of belonging that brands bring to the world and how that void was kind of left by other institutions in the past, and how we're kind of gravitating towards companies and organizations to find our sense of collective identity. And then I want to get into some fun stuff. We watched a Nickelodeon documentary recently, and I think they applied this understanding of creating a sense of belonging like just phenomenally. So hoping we can go along that path.
Yeah. So I think we started with villages, right? And as we settled into villages, we saw the extreme advantage of cooperation towards survival. And the more we did that, the more we became dependent on that cooperation for survival. And fast forward 10,000 years, and you got all these nations warring each other, and World War II was actually a really good sign of that starting to fall apart, because you had to mix these identities in order to, for the good of everybody, right? And so we started moving away from this hyper nationalist identity, right? And actually, people argue like we first dipped into like greater nationalism, but I mean, the very next generation was like, there are no borders, this is all bullshit, right? So we really have been moving away from national identity. And then in the last like 5 to 10 years, you see this increase all over the world in a spike in nationalism and populism. And so, not to equate the two, but we're trying to move quickly here. So what's happening is I'm willing to bet you right now that rise in like a desire for national identity is actually the recognition of it disappearing, right? So it's kind of like the swan song. I always compare it to like the toddler throwing a tantrum before they go to bed. That people are recognizing like, holy shit, my identity is disappearing. And so they're clinging to it, but that doesn't change, anymore, that it's disappearing and fast. At that same time, you see this rise in lifestyle brands, right? And like, if you really think about what does that mean, right? Oh, a brand as a lifestyle, right? Like, I mean, I call that church, right? Like, I mean, there's or 4th of July, like wearing the flag, like being an American. Like if I'm no longer being an American, but instead I'm being an Apple user, right? Like that's a very big shift, right? We're not talking about lifestyle brands. We're talking about, a new trend of getting people to deeply identify with brands. At the same time, you had, I was at Singularity University, and you had Paul Sappho talking about kind of the future, and we're talking about where we think, as people leave urban centers because of remote work and all these different things, like, what do we think this will be? And this was 7 years ago, by the way. But as that happens, the suggestion that Paul Sappho made was he actually thinks we're going to move more to like this city-state model and away from these big nation states. And so actually a return to city states, right? And so as soon as he said that, it clicked for me, and I was like, well, what will the city state be, right? Because first of all, you have to understand we'll all be remote workers, right? So there'll be no reason to like have the city state of San Jose or Fremont.
Yeah, because it's all virtual.
It won't be around geography anymore.
Yeah.
It'll actually be like, so what will it be around it? So the first thing I thought of was, I was like, well, it'll be like digital communities, right? Which I'm sure will happen. But the very next thing is like, no, it's already happening, right? It starts to form around brand, right? And then you have stuff that, like, just in the last week or so, people have been sending me articles about different brands petitioning to be able to like govern themselves and govern employees in different areas. So Disney,
that's wild.
Disney started it, right? Disney did it.
Wow.
In Orlando, and that's the reason why there's Disneyland. They created Disney World because they wanted to be able to actually own the entire property and then petition the government to be able to govern that.
So it's some kind of sanction, that property.
They have their own police force, everything.
Wow.
Right? So similarly, right now, there are other companies petitioning to do the same things in certain areas. And right now, it's only in areas where you have, like, basically all that's there is going to be like this massive Amazon warehouse or something, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, it's a really small leap then, where it's like, oh, it's a little bit bigger. It's a little bit bigger, right? Anywhere where the majority of the employees work for Amazon, let's just like, we'll let Amazon govern them, right? And we've already done this, right? With the railroads, with a lot of the mining, we had company towns where the mining company owned the entire town and owned everything in it. And it was horrible for people. I mean, it was like creating these little dictatorships for the company. So we already know this model doesn't work. We don't like this, and we don't want to go back to it. And so I'm actually really concerned then about like what that looks like, especially when you're creating this like fully identified kind of cult-like behavior with it. I think that gets really interesting. So belonging is super powerful, probably arguably our most powerful driver. There's a lot of people, there's some disagreements you can make in there. But I think it's, there's also a lot of really strong arguments to say
Yeah.
it is the most powerful human desire.
Well, I think there's a lot of evolutionary biology behind, like, I think there's a lot of really good sound science behind us. Like our social nature is like people, I mean, there's so many ways to look at it and see that when we lack in connection, like we die, like we actually die.
Human babies have the longest period of abject dependence of any other animal.
Yeah.
Okay, it might not be any other animal. I know it's any mammal, and I know it's pretty damn close to any other mammal or any other animal, because mammals are more dependent as young than other animals too. So, like a giraffe is born and it just kind of like falls out,
and then it just Bambi's around for a little bit.
It does its thing, right? And then you're talking about fish, like they just do their own thing. Like it's not an accident, right? Why are we so dependent from birth? And what it does is because it forces us to create extremely intense social bonds, right? And actually, when you want to see a human go really wrong, like fuck that period up, right? Like create a problem in that period, and you'll have generally an extremely dysfunctional human being. And so this is critical to our survival. But there are good ways of doing it too, right? And churches have really abused it in ways, and churches have also done a lot of good in the world for people, right? And then I say church, but that could go for synagogue or mosque or anything as well, right? Like religions have been kind of the gatekeepers of our community for a long time. And there's good in that, and there's a lot of really bad in there too. And so I think we have this opportunity moving forward to not let our businesses become cults, and actually even improve upon what religion has done. And how beautiful could it be if kind of the next wave of our cultural gatekeepers actually were wonderful stewards of community in all the great ways, and also didn't encourage people to kill each other for being from the wrong
gang. For sure.
So tell me more about jog my memory about the Nickelodeon documentary.
Yeah, so one of the biggest standout motifs of their whole perspective and approach was creating a space. This is completely revolutionary. This was in a time where there was very little programming intended for a child audience. They had this grand vision of creating a space, a network on cable television, which was very innovative back then, where a kid can just feel like a kid, like they have space to be who they are and be embraced by other kids in a similar mindset. And they went to extraordinary lengths to pull that off in ways that are just unimaginable. And the value of that, especially at that age where people are really developing, to feel validated, to feel heard, to feel like accepted for how they be in life, I think is really critical.
So Nickelodeon creates a channel. It's a safe space for kids to just be kids, and however that means, whatever they want to be, and it ends up being hyper successful. There's a major gap in that story. And what that is what was the context that channel came into being in the first place, right? And so it is impossible to tell that story without it being actually a story about the rejection of Disney and its paternalism. Now, I love Disney and I love the things that they're doing. But it's just like anything, like it doesn't get it totally correct. Disney defaults towards hyper control, right? And so they create these hyper controlled, curated environments, and in a way, it's really about social engineering, right? Which gets a bad rap, but I think social engineering in some cases can be a good thing. I'm sure that quote will come back to haunt me.
For sure.
But it's definitely factual. Walt Disney himself had deeply paternalistic ideals. And that paternalism infected the entire organization and kind of still lives out in the organization a lot today. They've done a good job of curbing some of the more problematic ways that paternalism kind of gets lived out in the organization, but it's still very present. And even when you take away like the overtly problematic things about it, you're still talking about a method of trying to control people into being better. Okay. And so Nickelodeon arose from these children who infamously just want to shake off any shackles you put on them. And we're like, man, I don't want this hyper polished view of my child's reality. I want to burp and fart and slime and like, I just want to and laugh and have fun. And so that's a really beautiful thing. And they tapped into something very, very beautiful. And I bet you probably the people starting it weren't totally aware of just how much it was a rejection of Disney's paternalism, right? But you're seeing a similar thing to some extent happening. The monarchy, the English monarchy, is deeply paternalistic too, right? And so like suddenly the whole thing happening with Harry and Meghan is Harry and Meghan rejecting this paternalism. And that's, you know, something very present in our generation, right? We want nothing to do with that kind of paternalistic attitude. And so no surprise, it's Nickelodeon that actually arose in our generation. You know what? It might be Nickelodeon's fault. It might Nickelodeon brainwashed Harry and Meghan, and then because they were key demographic at the time, right?
Yeah.
Brainwash them out of paternalism and then ends up having this network effect. Now, that could totally be true. We don't know.
I mean, the likelihood is very high because they had a staggering, I think like over 50% ownership of child screen time.
Totally.
In their back in the day, which is impossible now with the internet. But just imagine that, like 1 out of every 2 kids is only watching Nickelodeon.
And it was a lot easier back then because of how many less devices and less channels and less options.
Yeah, exactly.
But still like a massive feat for an underdog at that time. Not only was there less options, there were more gatekeepers. And so this thing, I think it started on like public access TV, right? I think.
Something like that, yeah.
So something like that. But it was like really started small and low budget, right? This wasn't, but it was a female like child psychologist or something like that, right? So more than anything, she just looked at kids and didn't treat them. How do I get them? How do I be who they want me to be in order to get what I want, right? Which is a sociopath. She didn't treat them that way. She treated them like you'd expect a child psychologist to treat them, where she saw them as people and then treated them as people. And it's funny because we could talk about brand and identity and this type and that type all night long. And ultimately all we're saying is just treat people like people, right? And this is where I feel like, IDEO massively failed, is that, it was a great leap forward from where things were before that. Holy crap, right? You didn't look at people as people, you looked at them as resources, right? And that's why human resources first came about during that time, right? And so IDEO is just introducing the idea, like maybe we should be empathetic to our stakeholders who we're designing for. Revolutionary idea at the time, but also now we can look back and say woefully undershot the mark, right? Where we don't need to, look at, who we're designing for and just make it for them. We need to like look at them as people and understand them and love them. And you could say like, well, within empathy, that's kind of what they mean, but I would argue that the outcomes that you see from design thinking actually aren't generally these deeply empathetic outcomes that are ecosystemally linked, linking people together. It's largely looking at people as nodes, and if you look at what they want, then you can get what you want. And it's like, well, it's still missing the point, right?
Yeah, and then like human factors being like one of the key pillars of, that's great. Like, yeah, like, to treat someone like a human being, yes, let's take into account anatomy and how we, can function with that. But it's a small slice of the pie. And
well, it just shows how they they grew out of product design, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, you know, and in a time when product design meant physical things, number one,
Yes. Yes.
and in a time where, you know, um, it's kind of like product design follows very closely to architecture,
Hmm. Yeah.
where architects are infamous. I love my architects, but architects are infamous for like designing sculptures that generally people don't want to live in. And so, you know, then they do this like they do these things for people and they design for people, but really they're designing for themselves first
Hmm.
and then for people second. And product design was very much that way, right? How do I make something that can sell first? And so a lot of people would call that, well, that's just capitalism, right? Like you got to orient yourself towards the dollar. And I actually think that's like a totally perverted view of capitalism. And capital, there's nothing, if you read, you know, any F.A. Hayek or, you know, Adam Smith, like there's nothing in capitalism that says like you have to prioritize the dollar above all other things. In fact, that's relatively antithetical to capitalism. So what you want to do is you want to, you know, and generally whether we're talking about capitalism or socialism or any other structure, we want to design for the ecosystem, right? And so this is full life cycle. First of all, where are we getting these resources from, right? And then how are they going to be used and how is that going to affect the people using them? And then what's going to happen to them when we're done with them, right? Like all of that is not like some high-minded liberal thinking. This is living in an ecosystem, and there's not another creature on this planet that doesn't take that into account when they, you know, create anything. Well, okay, viruses, locusts,
Maybe.
Not any creature we would want to emulate.
Well, none that we consider to be conscious living beings. But yeah, I mean, people forget we live on a rock inside a bubble. Like we're stuck in here. We're on a ship, and if you're not taking account of your fuel and your reserves and all these things, like while you're creating stuff on this, like we're gonna run into trouble.
And we are running into trouble, right?
We have ran into trouble.
I heard in a clubhouse today, the CMO of OkCupid was talking, and she said that the number one factor, the number one deal breaker, right, where girls will immediately just be like, nah, is a deal breaker, isn't income, it's not looks, it's whether or not you believe climate change is real. It's the number one deal breaker in dating right now.
That's fascinating.
According to the CMO of OkCupid.
So you just got to smell good and believe in climate change and you're good to go.
You know what I mean? I wish I had known that, right? I would have shown up to every date like, man, look at this weather. Crazy, right?
Yeah. So back to Nickelodeon. We're creating a space where children are being heard and treated as humans. And that magically, shockingly manifests into this massively successful company that's still, you know, tearing today. So how do you get from, you know, this kind of intuitive desire to create a space where children can feel free to express themselves? How do you kind of create a tactical brand strategy around that in a way that nets you the success that Nickelodeon has had?
Okay. It starts a step before that. Okay. And you have to, you know, Nickelodeon was so successful because they filled a deeply human need. Okay. So one, fill a deeply human need, right? Peter Diamandis always says the world's biggest problems are the world's biggest business opportunities. Some people find that phrase kind of cringy, but I like it. You know,
I love it. It's true.
I think it's true. And so let's solve this. So I think that's, you know, especially when we get past just that practical stuff and go down to like what's deeply human about it. When you solve those, people connect to it and jump on. The second thing on that in particular is that they actually solved a deeply human need that was being pushed down, right? And so it was in reaction to something. And so you can look around, you can say, what are people crying out for that is not only being not supported, but it's actually being repressed, right? And so to me, I think one of the biggest answers to that in our world today is like sex positive culture. I think you look all around the world, it's still not okay to just be like a sexual person. And it's like, we're just people. Like, it's literally the most natural drive you'll have in your whole life. And somehow there's like a ton of people feeling shame over it, right? Especially, we're just coming off of the shooting at the massage parlors, and there's other problems at play there for sure, right? Like the deeply misogynist issues, problems with the way Asian women have been treated in our pop culture and things like that, right? So not taking racism and misogyny out of that equation, but recognizing like, yeah, when you shame people about their sexuality as a way of life, when there's nothing they can do about it because they're an animal, then yeah, like shame isn't the answer. The education is the answer, right? He needed somebody to just talk to him and say like, it might be normal to have those feelings, and it's not normal, then it's not okay to act on your feelings or frustration about that. And so more compassion, more acceptance, more generally, I think, is just what we need, a big way to do that. So anything you're solving a business problem that feels deeply compassion and acceptance, I think, especially if you could tie that into sexuality, then I think that's a fast moving train, right?
Yeah,
But
and that industry is booming like crazy.
Totally. So that's step one, I think. And booming on both sides, right? Like the massive explosion in the last 10 years of porn and the porn industry, however you feel about it, is also a sign of that same thing, right? So anyway, lots of debate to be had on those topics, but you can't change my mind that they aren't important issues that people are going to connect to. The next step is you have to understand that there's two types of communities. And I get this from my mentor and yours, Barry Brown, who's
the guy.
He says that there's two types of communities. There are boundaried communities that are held together from kind of the outside in, with rules, regulations, structures, hierarchy, right? And like there are reasons that either make you in or you're out. You either abide by the rules and this makes you one of us, or not. Okay. And boundaried communities exist in all kinds of forms. There are really toxic examples and there are pretty normal examples. Like, it's not necessarily a bad thing. But then there are centered communities. And especially if you're talking about building a business, I think you're far better off in a centered community. And rather than forming rules and regulations to keep people in, what you do is you form a really clear center. And then the people decide how close into that center they are, or they're maybe out on the periphery based on how well they align with what your center is. So what's that thing at the center? Surprise, it's identity, right? Yeah. And so a well-formed identity, and this is actually how we form friendships. Healthy people form friendships by having a very clear formed identity, and then people gravitate to you or drift away and call you once a month or once a year based on how aligned those identities are. And so what we want to do is we want to form organizations with a really, really clear sense of identity, so that people who vibe with you, people who align, gather around. And then once you kind of have that, then you need the structures in place. And how do we know what structures to put in place in order to form that kind of belonging and community? Well, look at the people who have been doing it for thousands of years, right? So you look at religions, and any religious house of worship, you're going to find three things, right? And you're going to find language, ritual, and symbol. Right? You're going to come in and like, I grew up Catholic. Right? I walk in to the church and immediately I'm already like saying stuff to myself. I have a ritual, right? I listen to the doctrine of the church for a while. We go through all these different ritual actions together, and all the while we're surrounded by all these symbols, all this symbolic, what we call semiotic messaging, right? And so
you guys at 7, I have to jump off, but I can make one of you guys the host so you can keep going.
Sure. Thanks, Alex.
Okay. So if you want to create a sense of belonging, sense of community, like Nickelodeon did, you start by what deeply human need are you serving, right? And I mean, it's important to keep in mind, Nickelodeon didn't start out by like, we're going to make kids feel like they belong, right? Like, no, they just spotted an unmet, deeply human need. So it takes you like, Damien's not going to magically going to give you the answer that you just go do. It takes you looking at communities and saying, how are their deeply human needs not being served, right? And actually, you can look at Jung and Jungian archetypes to look beyond belonging and connection. There's 3 other deeply human needs, but belonging and connection is arguably the most powerful. And then is it not only not being met, but is it being repressed somewhere else? Okay, so first start there. Second is ask yourself, are you a boundaried community or are you a centered community? And likely you want to be a centered community. It's a lot less effort to just create a clear sense of identity rather than trying to manage everybody, whether or not they're, abiding by the rules and are they in or out. And
yeah, that sounds like government.
no, exactly. And so the more you create a strong center for people to gather around, you end up in this place where you live, like the book, The Power of Pull, really talks about this effect, right? You pull people to you instead of always having to push your rules out to everybody. And then the third thing then is you want to, once you have this clear center, you want to create language, ritual, and symbol that solidify the concepts of what that center is for the people coming around. And when they get to enact those behaviors, see those symbols, hear that language, and use that language, that's what it means to be a part of a tribe, to be a part of a community. And so when you can create that kind of community for people, they start to get this deep sense of belonging for being there. And if you think about different organizations that you're a part of, I was in the military. We have very much our own language, our own vocabulary for everything. There's the uniform, you put it on every day. It's the most powerful symbolic act we have is when you actually don the garments. It happens in every single rite of passage all over the earth. You're always donning new garments as a symbol of putting on a new identity. It's because it's a very powerful thing, right? Military, we do it every day. And then of course there's all kinds of ritualistic action. So, any kind of group is like that. Sports teams, right? Like, oh, why do you wear uniforms? Just so the other team knows who's who. No, like,
sort of.
you know what I mean? Like there's all kinds of reasons why we have these things, and any kind of in group that you've been a part of will show you how to do that. Now, the next step is, and this is an important one. Okay. This is an important one. The next one is you ask, how can this community that we're creating serve another community or likely the world, right? And it's the point a lot of people skip. Okay. They get real excited about, I can make them click on more ads or press the like button or whatever. And so they just stay at like creating this sense of community, but they don't then go put people into service, because it's a deeply, deeply important part of being a member of a community is you have to be useful.
Yeah.
Right? If you settle into this village 12,000 years ago and you're not useful, like goodbye, right? We're going to let you get eaten by the saber-toothed tiger. Like only the people who are useful. And that's why we feel super empty when we're not useful. And the community should exist in order to create some good in the world. So even a bigger question is, once you have the power of this community harnessed, sure, how does it benefit you? That's fine. But also then how are you putting that into action to where it works within the ecosystem, right? Because if it's only benefiting you, it's going to go wildly wrong in some really wild ways, right? Again, I can name you a whole bunch of people who've done that. But when you put it into service of the world and you benefit personally from it, that's the only way you're going to achieve some kind of longevity, sustainability, because otherwise the ecosystem itself will eventually crush it.
Yeah, and I think one of the strongest indicators of a strong brand is when you have your audience, your community generating value themselves in name and in service of the brand.
Absolutely.
And that makes sense.
Who doesn't want that, right? I mean, like, oh, free word of mouth advertising, free, user generated content, like, of course, I'll take it for any one of our clients all day long, right?
And that's what it looks like on the business books. But in reality, what it looks like is feeling like a part of something larger than yourself, and feeling that
Ooh.
gift of giving.
That's even, it goes even deeper than that. The feeling part of something larger than yourself is still also the byproduct of finding yourself, right? And so what we do is the when it's done well, right, we find ourselves in the places where we belong. And then we feel a part of something greater than ourselves, and then we find a sense of purpose and all these other things, right? But the relationships where we are most seen in are the ones we most grow in. And so when we come together and we're seeing each other and seeing and being seen, then we grow, we find ourselves, we increase in self-awareness, we find a sense of purpose, we're more productive, and so when you can put that to work in a way that serves bottom line factors, that's great, and also serves the community, serves humanity. There's zero reason not only like to not do that, right? It's just short-sighted to employ it in a way that only takes from people to get what you want. When you employ it in a way that helps people, everybody makes more money. You make more money, and people love you, right? And you don't eventually get a documentary made about you called, the social dilemma, that exposes how you're increasing the suicide rate of preteens, right? Like, what a horrific thing to have tied to your brand. And regardless of the economic impact of that, like, is that the impact you as a person want to have in the world? Like, no, thank you, I don't want that. So I think doing these things consciously, right? I kind of don't necessarily love that language, but really, right, being very aware of what is it that you're trying to create, and remember, like, you can't do it outside of the ecosystem. Doesn't work. It's very short-sighted, and you're gonna, even if you get away with it, you'll create damage that that I highly doubt. I've never been somebody who really wants to be responsible for that kind of damage.
Yeah, I don't think anyone would. Man, it's crazy how, the onset of the notion of a social enterprise is how we have to distinguish that from the regular kind of enterprise. It's like every enterprise should be a social enterprise. That's how, I think it just goes back to this kind of perverted view of capitalism that we've developed somehow.
Well, so what do you call an enterprise that's not a social enterprise? An antisocial enterprise, right?
Yeah.
And like, antisocial behavior is what a psychopath is, right? And so, like, it's always been here, right here with us, right? Don't create an antisocial enterprise. We don't want to create antisocial behavior in people. And yeah, the companies we create are expressions of ourselves, and then influence others. And so, do you want to express your most sociopathic tendencies out on the world? And do you want to influence others with those tendencies? I would hope not.
I would hope not. Well, we got a little heavy. Maybe we can find some silver lining on this whole topic, and then we'll wrap it up.
The silver lining is that, I think people do understand this. I think I'm talking about this right now.
I guess you were talking about this right now. We'll have to see if we can get Damien back. Well, in the event that Damien can't find his way back on this in the next couple minutes, I'll take a stab at wrapping it up. I think that the fact that him and I are having this conversation right now is a sign of the tides changing. It's a sign that people, are starting to recognize on a grand scale that the way we've been doing business for the last 50 years plus is just really not serving us. It's short-term thinking. We're starting to have enough time to feel the long-term effects of, and there's definitely been a shift in the tide, and people being a lot more aware of how, as an organization, we have this influence. This is huge responsibility that we are imbuing ourselves with as these bigger organizations grow in their the ways that they're serving people, and also the communities that they're forming, and the pool that they have to impact lots of people, not just people in their organization and their customers, but everyone around them as well, all stakeholders involved. So the fact that we're having this discussion is a good sign. And I am supremely confident that the more these ideas get expressed, the more we're able to articulate the value in valuing human beings, from a bottom line standpoint, but also the experiential standpoint. I think as our voices grow and start to echo on that front, we'll start to see the fruits of that in the way that we're getting to interact with and create value for each other out in the world. So on that note, cool. That was episode 1 of our Prismonde pod, working title, and it was great. And we're excited to keep doing this weekly. So stay tuned. See ya.